Hello, good morning everyone and welcome. Hello, good morning everyone and welcome. I'm glad to see everyone's feeling at the top end of the wellbeing scale today. My name is Michelle Jamin and I'm one of your chairs for today's conference on technology, education and wellbeing. I'm also one of the conveners for the BERA Special Interest Group on mental health, wellbeing and education, along with my colleagues, Anthea Rose and Jonathan Glazard, who are both here today, and you'll be hearing from a little bit later on. The three of us, when we first envisaged this event, we were planning to do a live event, to host it as a live event. And that was, of course, before the pandemic, before we knew how much our lives would be so dramatically affected. And when we were planning it, we could not have foreseen just how much the world, and for everyone here, most pertinently, education would be impacted by the reliance on digital technologies in order to cope with school and university closures and to keep, educating learners. So the purpose of today, the focus really is on how this rapid change and the great expansion of the use of technologies in education, how that has had an impact on educational communities, and most importantly, on mental health and wellbeing. So we're delighted to welcome four speakers who will be talking about their recent research in this area. And we're also looking forward to hearing from you, your comments and views at the panel discussion session, which will be closing today's event. And I'm also very pleased to say that we are co-hosting today with the Education and Technology Special Interest Group. And my co-chair, Lydia Limperis, will introduce herself in a moment. So before I introduce the first speaker, but just fingers crossed, everyone, that the technology is on our side today and we don't have any hitches. So Lydia, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. I'm Lydia Limperis from Newcastle University, where I investigate ways of promoting deep learning in hybrid remote educational environments in geographically and socioeconomically isolated settings. And together with Francesco Majorana from Kansas State University, I co-convene the Educational Technology Special Interest Group of BERA. And I'm excited to be here today. Thank you very much, Michelle and Anthea and Jonathan.
Lovely. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. That's Dr. Carmel Kent, who is Head of Educational Data Science at Educate. And she will be discussing lessons learned about learning and technology from evidence collected during the pandemic. And there will be a few minutes to ask any questions after Carmel's presentation. And my colleague Anthea will be fielding any questions. But don't worry, if you don't have time, we don't have time for all your questions. We can pick them up during the panel discussion at the end. So now it's my pleasure to hand you over to Carmel.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me? I guess, yeah, okay. So March 2020, COVID-19 shook the education systems across the globe. And we all know how it looks like until now, at least. The implications on education were both transformational and terrible, or at least we hope it was, or at least we hope it would be transformational, which brings up one of the most interesting questions, at least to my mind, about which lessons would be learned. But, in the UK, as well as across the globe, the COVID-19 has surfaced many existing structural barriers and already existing inequalities. And on the other hand, it has catalyzed the sort of technology use in education that would normally take many months or even years. So for us researchers, it was a very rare opportunity to observe, to collect evidence, and to learn, of course. So we at Educate Ventures, together with Cambridge University Press, have started collecting data actually right away. We are collecting data, and with the main aim of mapping the main challenges, opportunities, support systems, and uses of educational technologies since spring 2020. The compiled research report is on a website. I will share some links later. It's a very thorough and very rich report, which with 2 volumes, one with the evidence and the other one with implications, and it's rich with a lot of tips and strategies and recommendations for policymakers, for teachers, for parents, and everyone. So, okay. And when I say we, okay, now I have the control. When I say we, I mean Educate. We are a group of researchers spun off of UCL Institute of Education over a year ago. And then the base of our activity is this golden triangle, which is the concept ascertaining the need to connect EdTech stakeholders such as researchers, EdTech companies, and obviously educators and parents around students, around children mostly, to better support learning and teaching. So if I can just start with the bottom line of the report and what we have been able to pick up. So I think the story is really a two-sided story. On the one hand, it's really not less than a heroic story of resilience and creativity of teachers and school leaders and parents and students. It is a story about magnificent opportunities for rapid improvement and really a story of amazing individuals. On the other hand, at the same time, it's also a very different story for the ecosystem as an ecosystem. So it's about an educational ecosystem that was not very well connected to begin with, in many cases even siloed, even fragile. And you know, when fragile ecosystems are being shocked, many mostly vulnerable people and many values that we have been holding very close to our hearts in times of peace are falling between the cracks. And that is what we have seen here. So, and if I can also raise my main worry, my main concern after, you know, holding this research for the last year is that what would be the lessons that we would be able to learn from this shock? I mean, we are already a year into this crisis, and what good stuff we would be able to pick up from it. So back to what and how we carried this research. So we have set a goal to ourselves to collect data as diversely as possible from a wide as possible range of educational stakeholders in order to consider as many voices, concerns, and opportunities, and to build a very inclusive and sound evidence base. And for that, we have opted to what we call the T-shaped strategy of data collection, which is what you see here on this slide, where you would address a wide set of research questions from a wide and very small sized samples and cohorts, but focus on a narrower set of research questions to drill deep into larger cohorts. So we've used interviews, Twitter analysis, many surveys. We have adapted surveys to EdTech companies, to educational leaders, to teachers, to parents, etc. And while it is still iteratively an ongoing research, we are continuously collecting new data, learning and refining all the time our research questions to build our evidence base and a set of recommendations on top of that. And so essentially what we wanted to see, we wanted to understand how does learning look like being hit by COVID, and what are the challenges and the support systems. And you can see some quotes from our interviews, but we also wanted to look at what are the opportunities and what is the learning process that everyone is being experiencing, and how do they evaluate technology specifically. So we have identified main 6 themes which I will very briefly mention. And each and every one of them emphasizing some angle to the triangle and some connect or disconnect in this ecosystem. So I think it's a very good mapping of where the focus would be needed in the perspective of the ecosystem. So maybe the first one was remote emergency teaching, as was named, which was probably one of the most evidential disconnects between schools and parents, and between research, and between edtech companies and research. And if there is if I would need to choose just one takeaway message about this disconnect, is that please let us all understand that online learning is not a bug, it's a feature. So I think, well, most schools in the UK weren't really using online learning on a day-to-day basis, or in any way that would be assimilated meaningfully with assessment and the daily teaching and learning. So we really didn't have time to just actually sit back and think, what are the kind of what do I want to achieve with my course that I'm teaching and with my students, and what are the learning objectives, and how would I reimagine learning if I would needed to do it remotely using online learning and learning technology. But since it's not going away soon, we all know that this crisis is going to stay with us in one form or another for quite a long time. It might be good to have this reflection and try to move from this mode of remote emergency teaching to a more long-term emphasis. Essentially, we have online courses and online degrees for more than 24 years now, and online learning enrollment even before COVID was growing much faster globally than enrollments of face-to-face settings. So obviously we have a very rich and effective literature and evidence base about how to hold online learning effectively. We don't really need to start from scratch. So that's one opportunity that I felt that has been missed to some extent. And I think there are in our report we brought many cited papers and many recommendations on how to do that, how to take the first steps, and how to build the longer term vision. I could also recommend for higher education practitioners the manifesto of teaching online, which is authored by researchers in Edinburgh University. You can also take a look at, there are so many great resources about how to do online learning effectively. UCL Institute of Education has a very amazing course on blended and online learning design, on Future Learn. And I think the questions to be asked would be, to what extent the pedagogical components that are known already to be on the good side of online learning. So we know that these pedagogies are really well supported by online learning, such as social learning, personalized adaptation, how to allow for more diverse, for more to be more inclusive, etc., etc. We just need to look and see whether these are being used or to what extent they are being used. So if you look at our report, for example, we have figures showing up that it's not being used as we would have wanted it to be used. For example, if you look at personalized feedback, you would see that approximately just 60% of primary school students and more than 40% of secondary school students did not receive any personalized feedback from their teachers during the lockdown. So I think that's one proxy or one way to look at it. If you look at the connection between edtech and schools, I think that's a very positive angle to look at. Of course, there's a lot to work on, but We have seen communication between edtech companies and school improved and impacted positively on the communication between other communities, such as parents and teachers, etc. A lot of edtech communications have been offering a lot of support and free technologies, and teachers were and teachers and parents were very engaged with those new technologies on actually on a daily basis at some periods of time. The appetite was there, and the will to actually measure, to evaluate, etc., etc. We have seen some very positive uptake in the edtech companies' use of data to really get to know who their customers and users are, but still most of them are using interviews, only interviews, and not a more holistic way of data collection, which still leaves some place to progress, I guess. Just a second. I think. Okay, sorry, don't know what happened. Okay, one thing to mention about edtech companies and the connection to schools is trust. Trust between technology companies and education systems could be very much undermined by surveillance and data collection. Sorry, and that's something that we are also mentioning in our report: safeguarding issues, etc. And that's one of the maybe potential for disconnect that we need to obviously talk about. Teachers' skill development. There was already a gap before COVID between the private sector, independent schools, and state schools, which we had. Which view? My view is stuck. I don't know why it is stuck. We have seen that the school lockdown had enabled some teachers to observe firsthand how much easier it is to manage, mark, and provide immediate feedback to students when a suitable technology is used. There was a lot of learning going on, probably the most steep learning curve coming from educators and usage of technology, but obviously they did start. Most of the teachers did start from a position that they had to do to put a lot of effort into develop themselves, and still there is so much to do in that area. One very positive side of the picture is the parental engagement. Obviously, it was tremendously challenging for parents. There was conflicting needs to support their children and attend their professional responsibility. But also we have seen that the disruption provided some great opportunities for an increased parental engagement, which I think we haven't seen. We haven't seen the last word from. We have seen a very clear correlation between parent engagement and how they are operating, parent engagement and parent communication with schools. And also, I think that one of the things that we might be able to see is that, and although I don't have hardcore evidence about that already now, is that there is that this increase of parents' involvement would also be one of the major factors for all kinds of new movement pushing against the current assessment regimes, for example, focusing on attendance, etc. So I think that would be probably one of the best thing coming out of the parental engagement. Going on to the less positive sides of this ecosystem, we have seen disproportionate disruption. So we know from the OECD data from 2018 that students from disadvantaged communities already had less access to personal technology and high quality of learning resources. But obviously, this crisis has enlarged significantly the gap. So we've seen that those who were already disadvantaged became more disadvantaged. So we are talking about children from higher level of deprivation, state rather than independent school, special educational needs students, and students that were already in risk of being excluded from the mainstream educational system. Yeah, okay, I see. I have two more minutes. That's fine. And so we've seen that, you know, these people or these communities were the one hit worse, and that if there is one indication of a fragmented and siloed ecosystem, this is the one. So I think the whole discussion about lost learning was also a huge indicator for disconnect when you know, we all know that CAMS is falling apart, etc. But maybe if we can see now that the government is pushing to address the lost learning narrative and to push for longer days and learning in the summer, instead of focusing on the well-being of students, I think that may be the most strong evidence for the disconnect. So yeah, I don't have a lot of time. There is a strong theme about inconsistent infrastructure, not just technical, which was obviously coming too late, too little, but also other elements of infrastructure like trust, like well-being, like attendance, physical attendance, and we have collected a very large and disturbing database of conflicting messages between the government and the schools, which I think would be one of the disturbing elements showing that there was a very huge disconnect. And one of our finding was that while more than 30% of heads and teachers and parents felt supported by colleagues and school leaders, less than 2.5% felt supported by the government. And we have the replication of this evidence coming now from Schools Week, we have from YouGov, so this is coming again and again. I will not go through these, although you are very welcome to look at our report. One last thing to mention, of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all image. So we have taken our data set of more than 1,500 respondents, including excluding edtech providers, so parents, school teachers, and school leaders, and we use 3 groups of variables to cluster the survey responses. We use their support systems, their main educational opportunities that they have identified as resulting from the pandemic, and the main concern that they have been facing. And we have been able to identify those 5 personas, 5 clusters, which very interestingly have quite a good distribution of all of the stakeholders. So we see parents, teachers, educators, primary, secondary, independent, and state schools in all of them, which comes to say again that, you know, we need to support people, we need to advise on support system, and we need to provide with support system that are really talking about their needs and not about who they are, where they come from, etc. So in our report, we are talking about those personas, what are their characteristics, how are they different from one another, and we are also suggesting different support systems. So I will stop here. We have in our report our main 10 recommendations for policymakers, 5 of them of how to connect better the ecosystem, and 5 of once you're connecting them, how to diversify the support. So I think that would probably be my main message to connect in order to diversify the support. And I will stop now.
Thank you, Carmel. Okay, we haven't got any questions. I hope everyone can hear me. I haven't got any questions, but that was really interesting piece of work. And the report, I do recommend everyone goes and has a look at it. I was wondering, what would you say are the lessons that should be learned in terms of mental health and well-being?
I think, as I said first, we need to prioritize that. That's one of the things that I was very, especially after having been so engaged with this research and with my own children in the last year, of course. I think one of the main lessons is to prioritize well-being and to prioritize diversity and inclusion. I think these are the most, these are the themes that were being harmed the most. We have seen that instead of actually using the online learning opportunities that we can use, we have seen that it was actually the other way around. So just as an example, if you can take a very, very simple example of whether to deliver synchronous versus asynchronous teaching and learning through the remote the remote learning period of time. It was very interesting because most of the schools started with completely asynchronous delivery of teaching and learning, just putting some assignments, no interaction with schools and teachers, no live interaction with schools and teachers, and resulting a very strong encouragement from the government. They went to the other extreme of delivering just live sessions throughout all the days. And I think we all know that how hard and challenging this is. And I think, we already have evidence that there are so many flavors in between and so many options to provide different a different dosage of live lessons and asynchronous interaction that would definitely fit different types of students or different types of teachers also. So I think that's one thing that was really talks about not prioritizing well-being, not prioritizing diversity.
That's lovely, thank you. Just before we move on, Jonathan would like to make a comment.
Just to mute myself. Thank you, Kamal. That was really interesting presentation. I just wonder whether you'd found any adverse effects on mental health, either for children or for staff, in terms of, for example, I found with my students that although they've appreciated the online learning, they still prefer the face-to-face, in-person teaching and learning, because obviously learning it's not just about learning, it's also about the social experience of meeting their friends, meeting other people, even just the face-to-face interaction with their teachers. So I just wondered whether although obviously there's been lots of benefits, whether you'd found any adverse effects in terms of mental health.
Absolutely, and I could also raise the other point, or the other way around. We have some evidence of students who had a very good effect of the remote learning on their mental well-being, and we have a lot of stories, both from interviews and from other data sources of students that usually were struggling to actually engage fully in the face-to-face setting, and now had another type of opportunity. But absolutely, I think we have the main concern of parents and teachers were obviously about the well-being of the children, and this social lonely, you know, being so lonely, the social isolation, etc., was a major, and we see in our data this decline of you know, optimism, of well-being, on how they feel. So it's a significant evidence from all of our evidence. It's absolutely there. Yeah.
Thanks, Carmel.
Thank you, Carmel.
We'll have to leave it there and move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Carmel.
Yes, really interesting. Thanks so much. I would like to now welcome our second speaker. That's Dr. Terry Hanley from the University of Manchester, and he will be talking about creating positive virtual ecosystems for young people that include self-help resources and peer and professional support. Again, you'll have the chance to ask any questions to Terry after the presentation or later on at the panel session. So thank you. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And I think it's sort of interesting sort of seeing where where Carmel took us, because I guess talking about ecosystems and sort of the mental health ecosystems that we live in is very much kind of part of my presentation as well. So today I'm going to be talking about this idea of a positive virtual ecosystem, and I hopefully will give you a bit of a sense of what I mean by that as I go, so I'm not going to explain that anymore. The thing I should say at this point in time is it's a large project, and I'm going to present a very top layer sort of slice of it, and there are a number of co-authors that are sort of on that initial slide that I won't mention now due to time, but just to make you aware of that. So I should be able to move these slides on. And here we go. So some context. I thought it might be useful to at least start with a little bit about who I am, just in the sense of why I'm doing this piece of research. So I'm a counselling psychologist. I have a history of working as a school-based counsellor and worked in schools for about 10 years. And my present work is around sort of looking at therapy in children and young people, and particularly looking at online therapeutic relationships. I have 3 kids myself who I'm hoping won't walk into the room whilst I'm talking, and one of them created this picture of me, which I think is probably captures my better size anyway, so I thought I'd put it on here. So that's me, but now I'd like to sort of hear a little bit about you before I get talking as well. So I've got 4 questions on these polls. So they're crude polls and they won't capture anything particularly scientific, but I'd appreciate it if you could maybe sort of just answer where you would seek support if you were looking for mental health and wellbeing support. Okay, so most are going towards friends. I'll just give it a minute to sort of let things settle. Okay, so I think we're settling a little bit. So the internet as a resource is relatively low, and most people would look towards friends and family. Okay, I'm going to shift us on to the next slide. Ooh, it's interesting watching it move. I'll shift us on to the next slide. So this one's a more specific statement. So how much would you agree with this following statement? So I'd be happy to work with a counsellor online. Okay, most people disagreeing. Oh no? Okay, we're starting to settle, I think, now. So most people would agree that they would be happy to. Some people very happy to. I'm interested in that skew personally. Now I'm going to ask you some sort of to put your remember being a young person and think, well, what would young people do? So if I shift on to my next question, it's the same sort of question, but this time I want you to think, where would young people seek support? So if you could, once again, think, where would they go? Okay, friends, the internet. So we're getting a slightly different picture this time. Okay, and I think we're slowing down again. So most people have sort of said the internet and friends as a main source of looking for mental health and wellbeing support. And then I'm going to skip on to our next question, which is, again, oh, you can see friends are moving up now and going down. Right, I'm going to skip on. So the next one is thinking about whether or not a young person would agree with this statement. So would a young person be happy to work with a counsellor online? Okay, we'll just give it a minute to level off. Oh, so now we seem to be in the kind of middle territory. Okay, so that's all really helpful, just to get a sense of kind of where our audience is in terms of thinking about health-seeking behaviour. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's interesting watching it move as well, because I guess young people is slowly, the accessing online therapy is sort of slowly increasing. But I'm going to move us on, and I'll come back to the young people's help-seeking behaviour in a minute or two. So some context around this particular piece of work. At the turn of the century, I had the pleasure of being involved in a project that mentioned technology, mental health, and young people in the same bid, and someone threw some money at us. That's my depiction of some money, which meant that I ended up researching, well, initially developing an online counselling service, which wasn't Kooth, but I guess it led me to doing my PhD work with this organisation. So some of you may have come across Kooth as an online counselling and support provider for young people across the UK. Currently, they see about 4,000 logins per day, which is a phenomenal amount. It almost doubled during the pandemic period. And they offer anonymous text-based support. So, as I note at the bottom, I don't work for Kooth, but I've been involved for a number of years in sort of supporting them develop their services. And some of that has been doing qualitative research with them. So that quote there is a quote from a young person who I interviewed about why they use the Kooth service. And on the other side, the little wheel is what we call the counselling goal system. So it was something that I was involved in developing with Aaron Sefi from Kooth. Which was a goal-based measure of looking at sort of measuring outcome based upon the young person's goals themselves. So I've been quite involved with them for a number of years. But the rationale for this particular project, so looking to try and understand Kooth and what it does in a larger way, really comes from its evolution. So I guess technology in therapy is nothing particularly new. We can go all the way back to the start of therapeutic literature, where Freud sent letters to some of the people that he was working with. Skipping on sort of a good 50, 60 years, we then have the development of the first artificially intelligent kind of chatbots in some ways. And Eliza was a conversation online, not online, the internet didn't exist then, but a computer program that people could chat with, and it basically reflected back the words that people used. And it was initially sort of created to almost prove that therapy without humans wasn't going to be any good. But what people actually did was they shared quite intimate information with it. If anyone's interested in that, if you Google Eliza, there's a version of it online at the moment, and you can kind of have a play with it. It's quite interesting. Then it sort of evolved. We've got things like relaxation audio tapes during the 1980s. And then in the 90s, as the internet grew, I guess online therapy started and computerized CBT really started to grow. And computerized CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, if people aren't familiar with the acronym, is now recommended for what the NHS would describe as mild to moderate depression and anxiety. So it's quite big business these days. So then online therapy itself has also received quite a significant amount of attention. There have been studies looking at access. Linked to our surveys at the beginning, I think what we're now seeing is that most people utilize the internet in some way for seeking support. And when we look at how young people, children and adolescents, use are accessing support for mental health and well-being, it's often the first point of contact or first point of help seeking that they engage in. So that might be doing Google searches, it might be contacting services like the NSPCC or COOTH just to get more information. And by no means is this sort of saying that they use the internet to actually access therapy, but it's their first point of call. Then the next bit, I guess process studies are looking at the quality of the therapeutic relationship that occurs online. And the research into that is starting to indicate that actually people are rating the relationships to be of a good quality. And that's also echoed within outcome studies, which when we look at the outcomes of online therapy that people are reporting, they're often at a similar level as face-to-face support. So this is starting to really challenge some of the history of psychotherapy, which probably focus more on face-to-face interventions. But, and it's quite a big but, a lot of therapists are quite reticent to go online. So when I trained to be a counsellor and a counselling psychologist, I trained all face-to-face. I was interested in the quality of the relationship, and the internet seemed a little bit of a problematic to me. Research is still, it's growing, but it's still very nascent, and it's struggling to keep up with technological advances. We're now sort of, seeing the advent of things like virtual reality headsets and artificial intelligence kind of coming to the fore more. So, and then online therapy can be quite different to face-to-face work. So people might present with slightly different issues. One thing that COOTH reports is you'll often get lots of people who may test the website. So they may be sort of young people sort of sharing issues that may not be, they almost kind of want to go on and ask particular questions. Or there might be things at the other end of the spectrum where people might be suffering from serious abuse, where they're also using it as an anonymous form of support that they would not receive elsewhere. So I guess it can be quite different. So part of what we hope to do in this project is really look more systematically at what COOTH and the service they're offering sort of is doing. And obviously, I've put COVID-19 has been an evolutionary catalyst for online therapeutic support. It's really just bloomed in recent in the recent months because there's been no other support available. So what we did, we wanted to explore the work of COOTH and describe the different elements of the service. I'll skip through a few of these due to time. The project itself was a collaborative piece of work with COOTH practitioners. So it looked at sort of really engaging with the professionals in that service to run a series of qualitative research projects looking at the type of interventions that they were offering. So each professional was given a territory to explore in more detail and try to make some sense of it. And that led to the development of what we call a theory of change, which is available in the report that's linked to this work. And as mentioned, it delves much deeper than the summary that I'm giving at this point in time. And then an important part of the work was also to share what we found and how we conceptualized it alongside additional staff members from COOTH and other professionals from other services, and also young people that were in the service. So this led us to this idea, this concept of the personal positive virtual ecosystem, which we liked because it obviously gave us a nice snappy acronym. And to give you the edited highlights of what we mean in this, so the positive really goes back to sort of the humanistic psychology roots of counselling and the services, and COOTH as a service. So humanistic psychology really prizes the idea that given the right environment, people will grow, that we're treating everyone as individuals and unique in their own right. So everyone who approaches COOTH may have similar presenting sort of issues, but often they need slightly different types of support. And also that idea of choice. When young people are going online, they're making a choice and using their agency to seek out support in that particular forum. So from a humanistic perspective, the idea is that if you provide that safe space to explore, then constructive growth can occur. And it's quite different from, I guess, the typical health service sort of view, which might be that you've got a mental health condition, so you're broken or in some way, and therapy might fix you. That's by no means the way that I think humanistic psychologists often view. I think it's not that people are broken, it's just they've not had the opportunities to grow and reach their potential. So that's the positive bit. Oh yeah, this is just a quote from Ben Goldacre, the bad science person, who often summarizes his sort of view of the world as, I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that. And I think the health, that simple narrative around people being broken and getting healed is not, sorry, I'm just looking at, I'm going to have to finish in a minute. I've just seen my nudge. So the virtual aspect, this relates to the internet. There are positives and there are negatives, the other way around. In terms of the positives, they're often convenient. They can be anonymous. People like that form of communication. And then probably the more important aspect of what this project was about was the ecosystem. So an ecosystem refers to kind of the interrelationship between the different components. And going back to kind of the history of therapy, this conceptualization from Duncan 2010 looks at where change may occur. And if we kind of look here, I'm not so sure if you can see my mouse, but this 13% small circle here reflects 13% of what might be perceived as the change that happens within a person's life. And actually, it's commonly viewed that most of the change occurs outside of the therapeutic relationship. Typically, therapy may be 1 hour a week, so it's understandable in some senses. So the ecosystem that Kooth has sort of consists of all these different elements. One is it's aiming to create this sort of caring environment. Two, it includes some static support. So it might be sort of online informative web pages. I will wrap up. The peer support that people might get from their own peers during online forums, and the professional support that people get from their colleagues, from professionals. Sorry, I'm dithering now. I'm going to move on to the questions bit and stop there. I hope that I give you sufficient information to get a sense of what a positive virtual ecosystem is. But if you want more information, then please do look at the report.
Thank you, Terry. That was fascinating. Really, really interesting. I've just got a couple of questions. So the first question is, are you getting a sense that more children, more young people have accessed online counselling during COVID?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. But whichever service you look at, they've almost, like Kooth has almost doubled in terms of its the access points. We recently published a survey looking at adult and young people services, and I think it consisted of about 40 online providers, and all have reported staggering increases.
And do we know what the key reasons are for that?
Well, there's the kind of key things people are reporting are things that aren't surprising. So there's stuff like loneliness, and people reporting issues around that are increasing. Health anxiety sort of is clearly on people's minds. And then there are specific issues, things like domestic abuse and kind of those kind of issues that you might anticipate due to families being kind of locked down during this period of time have increased as well.
And this is not a question, more of a thought, really. So it's interesting how the internet can be, for some young people, it can be a very dangerous place, can't it? Because they can experience cyberbullying, etc. But it can also be a safe space. And I was thinking about LGBTQ plus young people who might be living in rural communities, who might not have access to other people that they identify with, but actually online they can form communities of support. Online they can meet other people who can provide that peer support. So I think it's interesting how the technology can be a risk, but it can also support mental health and well-being.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to encapsulate, sort of say in some ways, is that the internet can be a great way of talk about these globalized local communities. It can bring transcend sort of miles, sort of, and countries in some ways to bring people together. But what was the thing I was going to say? But within a system like Kooth, I think that positive element is really trying to sort of make it a safe space. So forums are moderated, and that there's a professional on hand if needed.
Thank you, Terry. Anthea?
Yes, there's a question here, Terry. Will the report be made available? Can you maybe put the link in the question and answers for people?
Yeah, I'm not sure where the question and answers are on my screen, but I'm very happy if people email me if I can't work out.
Or send it to Vera, and then they can send it to the delegates list. Okay. And I've got a question from John Jones. Is there a positive virtual ecosystem for primary age children?
There isn't at the moment. I think Kooth is primarily, it's targeted towards 11 to 25-year-olds at the moment. From what I understand, there isn't any services for under that, for younger than those ages.
Okay, and so do you think there could be one for, he's particularly concerned for children aged 9 to 11 because he's noticed an increase in specific mental health issues once the domain of adolescents and children in this range.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether or not the NSPCC kind of service offers support for those age ranges. I think there's clear potential for developing services for younger age range children, but yeah, I'm not sure who would do it, if that makes sense.
Okay, lovely. We'll leave it there then. Thank you very much, Terry. That's lovely. Thank you. So I think now we're moving on to our poll. Hopefully. There we go. So now we're going to have a few minutes just to do a poll. So we thought we'd have a poll to do with technology and how things have been panning out. So overall, during the COVID pandemic, has your increased reliance on technology helped to decrease your work-related stress? Has it contributed to an increase in your work-related stress, or has it had little or no impact? Because I think we're all making assumptions that it has had a negative impact, but maybe for some it hasn't. So just give a few minutes for the poll to run through until everybody fills it in. And so I don't know if you can see the results up there, but 48, nearly half, are saying that it has increased their work-related stress. But interestingly, about a third of you are saying that it hasn't. It's going up and down just a little bit. And it's quite a good percentage are still saying that it hasn't had no impact at all. I haven't voted myself. So is that it? Is that everybody voted? I think it has. Okay, so that's interesting. So everyone, I think there's an assumption out there that for a lot of people it has automatically increased the stress, but the poll amongst the people here today is saying it's quite varied, really. I think it's settled. I think that's everybody. Oh no, there's another one. Interesting that 35% say that it's had little or no impact on their work. And it shifted again. Has everyone voted? Just give it another second. Okay, I think that's great. Thank you very much, everyone. And that's interesting because today the people on the call will come from lots of different places and have different experiences. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Lydia, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Anthea. Yeah, and on that note, I am delighted to introduce to you, sorry, my video. Okay, it's come back on. I'm delighted to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Shweta Meyer. Shweta is a lecturer and researcher at UCL Institute of Education, based at the Department of Learning and Leadership. And today, Shweta is going to present an overview of her research on the potential for technology-based intervention for social and emotional engagement to support children and young people's mental health, given the context of COVID-19. And again, any questions that we don't have time to answer after the presentation, we can come back to during the panel discussion. Welcome, Shweta, and thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lydia. Hello, everyone. My name is Shweta Meyer. I'm going to apologise that my video might cut out because I do have unpredictable internet connection. I'm a lecturer and researcher at UCL Institute of Education, and I'm going to speak with you about the potential for technology-based intervention, specifically for social and emotional engagement, and also through this to support children and young people's mental health. This is clearly poignant given the fact that we are within a COVID-19 context, as I like to refer to it. This is an area of research that I'm currently involved with. In fact, I've just begun to be involved with. My remit is to bring together research into designing technology-based interventions and supporting children and young people's resilience, especially when they're experiencing stress. Today I'll be referring to technology as a tool that engages children and young people socially and emotionally. That's the first priority, as it were, for me. And I'll refer to this as social and emotional engagement. My aims are to share with you my insights from a scoping of the most current published work on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on social, on psychosocial health and mental health of young children and young people. And I've decided just to present this to you because obviously we have a finite time that we need to just kind of communicate with you. And I just felt that it would be helpful to have the most current ideas that are beginning to emerge from research as it's being conducted within COVID-19 context. So I'd like to highlight existing technology-based tools that target social and emotional engagement and the relationship with improving mental capacity and thereby mental health. My specific interest is in developing self-regulation, and some of us might refer to that as resilience. So just considering the impact of COVID-19 on mental health of children and young people first. So publications during COVID-19 pandemic are finding very specific areas of impact, education disruption, onset of problems with physical health, mental illness, uncertainty about the coronavirus disease itself, relationships within communities, be that school, be that a local setting, using technology for learning, including screen time that's dedicated towards this, and other risk factors for becoming infected. So that sense of the fear of becoming infected with COVID-19, with the coronavirus disease. And all of this is having an effect on children and young people's mental health. And I've just given an example of two very current, two of the most recent publications on that. I have a reference list at the end if anyone's interested in exploring this further. So, given that there is beginning to be noted within the literature the impact of COVID-19 on children and young people's mental health, I also was interested in learning about, well, what is the psychosocial impact? on children and young people within the COVID-19 context. And I've highlighted a paper by Gosh, a review in fact by Gosh et al. And they noted 3 social factors that influence individuals' mental, physical and emotional well-being. So one of these factors is related to children who've experienced quarantine. So quarantine children that are essentially socially isolated can experience being ostracized due to social stigma. And that can lead to mental illness, such as developing anxiety, depression, self-harming, and where this is much, much more poignant, having suicidal tendencies or post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a review that was conducted by Gosh that's beginning to give us some ideas about, you know, the impact of being quarantined. School closure can impact on social relationships. We are all aware of that now. We're experiencing that. And this is relationships with peers and also with teachers. There are implications to physical health, as well as risk to poor diet and sleep disturbance. There is, of course, the disruption of routines that arise, and these also are influencing mental health. There may be an impact on mental health, such as experiencing loneliness and social anxiety, and the very nature of lockdown, i.e. the stay at home, can risk occurrence of child abuse and domestic violence. So all of these areas of concern that we have around mental health are beginning to emerge within the literature, albeit the most recent literature. And of course, as we move on, we'll be exploring and we'll be reporting on this for all of those, regards to all of us who are interested in this area of work. So, yes, so as part of the Public Health England drive to gather evidence for prevention and intervention programmes before COVID-19, targeting children and young people's mental health, Robson conducted a systematic review of literature on universal approaches to improving children and young people's mental health. I've just spoken about very specific influences, but before COVID-19, Robson had looked at more universal approaches. So Robson found approaches were either directly or indirectly targeting children and young people's mental health. That is, approaches were either socially or individually orientated. So socially orientated approaches, which I've kind of grouped up here to be targeting teachers, parents, carers, or teachers, children and young people and parent carers. Individually orientated approaches, I've actually just listed here with respect to targeting children and young people themselves. You know, we can note there are some very specific areas of approaches that are targeting teachers, and we can recognise that. So some of the examples on my list here is anti-bullying. Sorry, I've just. Okay, wonderful. So some of the approaches that are targeting teachers refer to anti-bullying, to support children and young people in this, healthy lifestyle skills and how to support children in this, multi-agency healthcare, and again, how to support children in this. And for parent and carers, naturally, that approaches are targeting their parental skills and problems, dealing with problems that their children may have, particularly with regards to behaviour. What's interesting when we have the more holistic approach, here we find that we have social and emotional aspects of development that are being targeted. So all children, teachers, children and young people and parent carers have approaches that are targeting social and emotional engagement to support children and young people's mental health. The list for children and young people themselves is much, much longer, and that's a healthy thing that we were finding before, and that continues at the current time. And here we have, you know, this is not a list in order of priority, but I've just started with alphabetically listing cognitive and behavioural training that we've already heard about. and also cyberbullying, which we have begun to discuss, dealing with mental health issues, having a healthy lifestyle, all the way to self-defense, and of course very much targeting social and emotional learning, as I've got down here at the bottom. Okay, so I think I can control this now. Okay, so coming back to technology and the use of technology, with regards to technology-based pedagogy, i.e. the design that underpins the technology intervention or prevention, I've drawn from a thematic analysis conducted by Chen et al. Just last year, in fact. And this analysis is of all the published articles in the British Journal of Educational Technology over the last 50 years of publication. The journal celebrated its 50th birthday in 2020, and Chen et al. Conducted this analysis to acknowledge this. And I think it's a really poignant analysis because they found that articles that were published in the last 50 years covered 15 themes as listed here. So there are articles that related to blended learning, socialized e-learning, there are review articles, articles that related to utilizing technology for online social communities. These are just to name a few. So what I'm interested in is the empathic pedagogic design used to enable human interaction with technology tools. And the prominent technology tools today, of course, are devices such as computers, smartphones, and robotics. And within Chen's list, we find that the pedagogic designs for software programming for tools such as this fall into two main modes of interaction. They can be social or they can be individual interactions with technology tools. The key question for me is what pedagogic design is effective, what empathic pedagogic design is effective for social and emotional engagement, i.e. the interaction between people really, and will this have a positive impact upon children and pupils and young people's mental health? Now, I'm going to focus just a little bit on more on the individual level. So at the individual level, how does the child and adolescent brain respond to social factors such as being quarantined, school closure that they've been experiencing, and COVID-19 lockdown? So this is a very simplistic diagram that shows the brain areas associated with social and emotional cognition and regulation. And when a child or an adolescent sees a social situation, what they see is communicated in the visual brain area, the occipital region. I'm showing that here in yellow. Then to the social area, the superior temporal sulcus region, which I'm showing here in red, and emotional area, which is the amygdala in blue. And finally, the communication begins to engage executive functioning, including regulation areas within the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in green. When there are disruptions in social experiences, such as experiencing social isolation, communication across these areas is affected, leading potentially to problems with mental health and well-being. And that's what I'm interested in exploring. So how is it that we might intervene to enable these communications to continue despite the fact that there has been some trauma or there has been some stress? So, and can we utilize technology to enable this? So I won't go through this slide in very much great detail because I have just highlighted some of these areas. So in your own time, you can read this. But the main thing that I want to highlight is that we do recognize that changes in how the brain communicates with each other area are influenced by both genetic and environmental factors. And what I'm focusing on in my own research are the influences that environmental factors have upon brain functioning, brain communication, and in particular, how that's associated with COVID-19 as we're experiencing it today. So coming back to how I'm relating technology, social and emotional engagement with mental health, the aspect of mental health I'm most interested in is in building mental capacity, specifically through self-regulation, which I've said that some of us might refer to as resilience. So mental capital in a very kind of overarching way is defined as the cognitive and education and emotional resources that we have to draw upon when we experience stress, be that acute or chronic, short-term, long-term stress. But we all have mental capacity, we all have resilience, those resources that we can draw upon. Now, this is governed by the brain's ability to process environmental factors that would potentially be causing this stress and enable us to deal with this. And this is through, as I've said, regulation, which we refer to as resilience. So I've created this map adapted from a diagram that was created following the Foresight Mental Capital and Wellbeing Project to show universal and targeted prevention and intervention supporting mental capital. Just very quickly, if we start with the green area, the executive function, this covers our capacity to regulate higher order executive functions of our behavior, cognition and emotions that I'm showing in blue. And those are the areas that I'm interested, which I refer to as regulation, i.e. resilience. The findings also suggest that universal prevention or intervention influencing social cognition, self-esteem, self-efficacy, speaking and listening processes that I'm showing here in yellow are actually influencing these regulatory areas in blue. And thereby, there is regulation of emotions, of cognition and behavior. So what we find is that there's a dynamic relationship between all of these areas of brain function that influence mental capacity. Now, the areas shown in orange are what we recognize as the core executive functions of inhibition control, attention flexibility, and working memory. These are consistently operating whether or not we do have high or low mental capacity and ability to regulate. I now have an interactive activity to gain a sense of your perspective of what I've been speaking about. So if I just show you that slide, and I will just run through it. So I want you to think about, given the COVID-19 context, with respect to technology-based learning, has there been or will there be, so what has been or will be the most to least pertinent area of technology-based learning for supporting children and young people's mental health for you? Is it social cognition, emotional cognition? Is it self-regulation and resilience? Is it self-esteem and self-efficacy? Or is it language and auditing processing, i.e. speaking and listening? So I'll give you just a few moments just to give you a sense of where your perspective is on this. So far, we've got a very clear sense of the executive functioning, self-regulation. Wonderful. So it's still coming across as executive functioning, self-regulation as more prominent, more pertinent, as areas to target to help children and young people. Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. So just looking at the rating summary that we have, well, I can see that the highest rating now has become self-regulation and resilience, followed equally by executive function, self-esteem and self-efficacy. in looking at your responses, I'm gaining a sense of which areas of children and young people's development are most to least pertinent to target design and development of technology-based intervention programs. And as I said, for me, that's in relation to developing their mental capital. So the last slide that I have for our finish, wonderful. Oh, can we move on to the next slide? Let me see. Thank you. So the last slide I have is just in a way a summary of where we are currently, where we're comfortable with, but also where we are projecting forward from in terms of the technology-based intervention and prevention programs that exist. I've based these on the list that I shared with you before by Robson, but of course I am mindful is that this list is not exhaustive, because there is an array of evidence-based prevention and intervention programs, including in the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit of evidence-based interventions. But here, what I've recognized and what I want to convey to you is that we do have universal programs that can be used as more preventative programs that enable general development of cognitive skills in social interaction and pro-social behavior. And I've named some of these tools for you. But there are also universal and targeted programs where we have more serious issues and where intervention is required. And these are targeted to those children and young people who we would consider to be at risk. So these are at-risk youth experiencing social and emotional and or behavioural problems and have more likelihood of developing mental illness as opposed to just having problems with their mental health, which are equally as of concern. And so we do already have some very specific technology-based programs that target and support these at-risk youth as well. So with that, I will end. So I've listed my references here, and I would say thank you very much. If you have any questions for me after we finish today, then I'm more than happy to respond to you. Okay. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Meta. That was really a lot of food for thought, I think, there, how the brain develops and how children react to their environment. And COVID is certainly something, an environmental factor that wasn't in the mix 12 months ago that we have to now factor in, I think, for some time to come. We haven't got any particular questions at the moment, and as time's quite tight, I'm going to move on, and Lydia is going to introduce the next session. Thank you very much, Veta.
Yes, thank you very much, Anthea, and thank you very much, Shavetta, for a very, very insightful presentation. So it is now with great pleasure that I welcome Doctors Michelle Jamin and Siobhan Lynham. Michelle is a lecturer in Education Studies and Child Development at the School of Human and Social Sciences at the University of West London. She is also, well, needless to say, but I'll mention it, she's also one of the conveners for the BERA Mental Health, Wellbeing and Education Special Interest Group, and a champion for the British Psychological Society Education Section. Dr. Siobhan Lynham is a senior lecturer in psychology, also for the School of Human and Social Sciences at the University of West London. She's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a member of the Irish College of General Practitioners and the British Psychological Society. Siobhan and Michelle have both published on topics related to mental health and well-being in educational settings. And today they share with us some preliminary insights into the lived experiences of higher education staff, which highlight the challenges of adjusting to online teaching methods and blended learning models in the wake of COVID-19. Thank you very much both, and the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you very much, Lydia. So I've swapped hats temporarily, so I'm going to be presenting. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I'm currently working on with my colleague, Siobhan Lynham, on higher education staff experiences of online teaching and learning in the wake of COVID-19. So technology, there we go, it works. So I'm going to start with some brief background just to explain why we felt research in this area was particularly important in the current climate. And then I'm going to hand you over to Siobhan, who will be sharing some of the preliminary findings and conclusions from the study. So, as we all know, in March last year, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic and a defining global health crisis of our time. And we all know the impact has been life-changing and penetrates deeply across all sectors of society. And as everyone here is acutely aware, the disruption caused to education and the impact on learning is unprecedented. The sudden closure of university campuses at the peak of the first wave resulted in an immediate switch to online teaching. And while learning technologies are certainly not new in education, the pandemic dramatically accelerated their use. Now, the magnitude of this change within the context of a global health pandemic has affected both teaching staff and students alike, and putting them at risk of poor or diminished well-being. So in the early weeks of online teaching, I gathered some informal feedback from HE colleagues in UK universities. These were actually collated into a podcast, which is downloadable on the BERA website if anyone is interested. But anyway, the common thread was that staff were really struggling with online working regimes, and this was having a negative effect on their well-being. So this really sparked the initial idea for the current study. And I was very interested in that poll earlier, where it was a sort of split 46%, 35, 46% saying that they felt they had increased levels of stress from online teaching and learning, and 35 reduced. So it'd be interesting to find out actually the different educational settings responses came from. And also, hopefully, we'll in the course of this presentation, we'll unpick why some of those factors, why there are some of those discrepancies. So just for a moment, let's consider the online learning environment. There have been several benefits associated with online learning: greater student engagement, improved performance, and course satisfaction. And of course, students have the flexibility of engaging in study in their own space and time. So that can enable interactions which may not be possible face-to-face. But with the physical environment removed, there are some unique challenges. So for example, there's more upfront planning and preparation needed to teach online. And students can expect teachers to be more available and respond outside of regular hours, as of course the technology allows this. And then interactions between teachers and students, as well as peer-to-peer, are very different online. And this requires very different skills to facilitate. And inevitably, teachers do need some level of technical skill to really teach effectively online. But regardless of these relative kind of pros and cons, in 2020, HE staff had little choice but to embrace predominantly online teaching methods. So I've just got a simple timeline here of change. So the implementation of learning technologies, as we said, it's not new, it's been expanded, but it has been expanding really since the start of the millennium. But with the onset of the pandemic, many of us found ourselves delivering classes exclusively online. This is where we are really in the present day. This, of course, begs the question, what will the situation be post-pandemic? But perhaps we can return to that in the panel debate. But of course, the prediction is that some form of blended learning will exist. So just to be clear, a simple definition of blended learning is here. So that's learning that happens in an instructional context, which is characterized by a deliberate combination of online and classroom-based interventions to instigate and support learning. So of course, the suggestion is that from this deliberate combination, learners benefit from the inherent advantages of both online and face-to-face delivery models. Now, some HE institutions did offer blended learning at the start of this academic year. Then, of course, all teaching was moved again to be exclusively online. And research on online and blended learning, it suggests that there's been a very narrow focus. So it's really been centering on sort of course outcome data and student satisfaction and engagement levels, predominantly using quantitative techniques. Quantitative measures of attendance and of performance are really the main methods used to assess course outcomes. And in terms of student experience, surveys were the main method used to measure satisfaction and engagement levels. And very interestingly, students' opinions and experiences were often prioritized over those of teaching staff. As we can see here, you'll notice, sorry, it's not a particularly clear graph, apologies for that, but oops, I've gone too far. The bottom bar, if you can see, the bottom bar represents studies which included data collected from students. So we're looking at around 60%. And the bar above, less than 10%, is data collected from lecturers. So quite a discrepancy there. But inevitably, the perspectives of all stakeholders really should be considered, and as well as using a range of methods to evaluate online and blended teaching models. But nonetheless, the evidence suggests that planning, resources, time, and training are all essential to have a successful transition from face-to-face to online teaching. Now, the sort of knowledge and skills required to teach online are distinct, and I know that just from my own experience, very different to those needed to teach face-to-face. So appropriate training is crucial. And of course, the success of any online method is reliant on equitable access to technologies, and we know that's not always the case. So the interweaving concern of our study is on staff experience of online teaching is the impact on well-being. Now, prior to the pandemic, staff mental well-being was a rising concern across all levels of education. And a recent study by Moorish, published in 2019, highlighted the severity of the problem in HE. Findings showed that the numbers of staff being referred to counselling and occupational health services had rocketed. You can see there were increases of 50%, quite common, but in some cases they were much, much higher. And several universal stresses were reported by staff. And these included excessive workloads, which were impossible to fit within allocated hours, a culture of performance management and increased scrutiny, and the uncertainty of precarious contracts. And another study, a qualitative study, this used in-depth interviews to try and unpick the key factors which impacted on HE staff well-being in order to gain an understanding of how well-being could be improved in the workplace. And I've just got a quick summary of the findings here. And so factors contributing to positive well-being included a management style that valued individual and team expertise. So getting professional acknowledgement made staff feel more trusted and valued, and also having some autonomy in terms of organising their own time and workload. But on the other hand, factors which had a negative effect on well-being were feeling isolated and a culture of performativity and bureaucracy, which was rife. And the consumer model was also seen as a generator of anxiety and pressure, with staff feeling that they had to do everything possible to keep student numbers high. So I'm going to hand you over in a moment to Siobhan, but just to kind of just summarise that, well-being was really considered broadly as being able to maintain this balance between work and personal life. And this was seen as a constant struggle. And just a warning there from HE staff, if we do not take the well-being of staff seriously, then higher education is not sustainable. Look after staff, value and trust them, or else the system will implode. So now I'm going to hand you over to Siobhan.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Okay, so thanks for listening to me. So we want to ask you to name one thing that you believe would improve your well-being in the workplace, and then we'll have a word cloud as a result, hopefully. It can take us a while for it to collate. Yeah, great. Okay, so reduce workload to manageable levels, trust, agency recognition, supportive leadership, compassion, trust, respect. Oh, compassion's nice and big now. Better communication, central decisions, working day, 10 to 4, that would be lovely. More training, sense of belonging in the group, social cohesion, empathy, understanding, mix of home and office working, tea, time. Compassion is still the biggest word. Yes, reliance on face-to-face online teaching. Respect, supportive leadership, half days for mental breaks. Very nice. Yes, nice idea. More training in creative times. Operation. Oh, trust, better communication, compassion. Now the big 3. Empathy, not isolated. Supportive leadership. Okay, I think it's may have stopped moving. Just give it another few seconds. Clearly, trust, compassion, and better communication are coming up as 3 big themes, which actually makes a lot of sense in what we found in our research. Okay, so we haven't had any more. Nothing else has been added. And okay, great. And I have control. Oh, I had control. Here we do again. Okay, so hence the rationale for our study, which is an exploratory study, and we hope to extend it based on what we found now. Okay, so basically, why do we carry out the study? So obviously, Michelle has spoken you through, a lot of the research and the background to it. So that's just continuing on that. So basically, higher education staff are often poorly prepared for speed transition, and certainly we were poorly prepared for the transition to online learning. And while we had some time in the summer to start preparing stuff, we didn't expect, I think most of us didn't expect for it to be 100% online learning when we came back to work in September. So that was quite a speedy, sudden transition for most of us. We all, higher education staff and teachers always feel this huge burden of responsibility for our students. Not just for their education, but for their well-being, and that they have a good university experience. However, this intensified over has been intensifying in more recent years, because of higher kind of, you feel more of a responsibility now for students than we may have in the past, where we felt that you would provide them information and then let them get on with it. But obviously now, in the current circumstances, that level of responsibility for most has actually increased. As Michelle's already spoken about, we already know that there's a lot of research showing that there is a huge problem with mental well-being amongst university staff. And obviously what's happening now is not going to be helping that. So we've had to make huge changes to how we work. Our workloads have increased because of the changes that are required. And obviously these are risks to our ongoing mental well-being. And what keeps people going is often good relationships with their colleagues, the students, and family and friends, and supportive networks around them. They're very important for maintaining positive well-being. So our research question was, what is the experience for higher education lecturers of adjusting to online teaching and blended learning models in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, so how do we go about this? What was our methodology? So basically our methodology was using solicited diary method. So we asked our participants after they have agreed to take part to carry out a diary entries. So in the beginning, we asked them just to spend 10 minutes a day to complete a diary entry. But in fact, judging by the data we got, our participants actually probably spent an awful lot more time than 10 minutes a day completing the diary. We chose this method because it was a good way, or we felt it was a good way of getting data and information of a lived experience as it was happening. And in fact, sometimes we often forget and block out things, especially if they're traumatic, but this way it was a way of capturing it as it was happening. And also diary, when we're writing diaries, we often are better at disclosing more personal details, and actually our participants were very kind and generous in that they were very giving of basically, you know, writing down very personal details of day-to-day experiences that were happening to them, but work-related and in their personal lives. So yeah, so it proved very helpful methods for us for gathering very, very rich data. Yes, okay, so we were very happy with actually how it went. So our participants, convenient sample, we reached out to lecturers across the UK, and actually 3 lecturers agreed to take part. All of them were female, 2 of them were in 35 to 55 age group, 1 from the younger age group. As I said before, they completed a diary every day, and we asked them to do this for 4 working weeks, so that we could see a kind of transition from, you know, when blended learning started to online learning. Obviously, we didn't anticipate what was going to happen, but it did give a nice flow through that process. They uploaded their diaries onto Qualtrics, which meant that the data was anonymous. We analysed the data using an inductive method of thematic analysis, so that's bottom up, so without any particular theory in mind before we analysed. But myself and Michelle were the coders, and we coded the data separately and then kind of cross-validated our themes. Okay, so what did we find? Okay, we found basically 4 overarching themes that I will talk you through and illustrate them with quotes from our various participants. So the first relates to the dynamic of transition. So this is the changes from face-to-face learning to blended learning to 100% online learning, and the effect this had on our lecturers' participants. So the sub-themes are disorientation, the unique stressors, and the consumer model. So the disorientation is illustrated here by 2 quotes, which I'll just read out first and then talk a bit more about it. The first one: "It has been hard to process. None of it makes any sense. After a few weeks, I realized there is no distinction between home and work." So that very nicely illustrates that it's very difficult to balance your life when your office and your home is the same place, and they start to blur into one. And that for a lot of the participants mentioned about how they were working non-stop as a result of the fact that they were always at work. And then for the next participant in green here: "I'm snowed under with work. I cannot really reflect on what is going on around me." So the disorientation is made worse by the fact that our participants felt they didn't have time to actually think about what was happening and take stock of what was happening and how to deal with it effectively. So participants were disorientated by the lack of distinction between home and work, the non-stop days. So there was it's very hard to have a 9-to-5 working day when you're at work all the time. So the unique stressors, so these are stressors that were brought on for the first time because of the change in away from face-to-face teaching, or things that were made worse by the transition. So this is a nice quote. I spent much more time on dealing with student concerns about learning, stress, and mental health. So because our students were under increased amount of stress, this was often shared with us, and we had to support them and try and do whatever was necessary to try and lessen their stress. A lot of students actually, despite the fact that we think that our students are tech savvy, a lot of them weren't, and this was often reported in the diary entries about how students actually struggled with the new technology, and this was an extra pressure on our participants to try and support students in that area, which I think was interesting, because we often assume, especially lecturers like myself who are older, we assume that our students are actually more tech savvy than us. Then there's the stress of the consumer model, which has probably always been the case, but possibly exacerbated for our participants as a result of the current changes. And this quote is, "We literally are not allowed to hold students to account or expect respect." So our participants often said about not being able to question students about poor work, and about one participant even said that their line manager actually suggested that they almost complete an assignment for students. Also, there was occasionally our participants mentioned about being disrespected, in comments and emails, and how there was no support for them as a result of that. Okay, so our next theme is about interpersonal relationships, and I cried with her, I think, is a nice quote from our data, which actually sums up the interpersonal relationships themes. So there's both positive and negative aspects to this. The first something about sources of support actually illustrate the positive aspect very nicely, and how important it was for our participants to get support from their significant others and family members, but also from their colleagues. So a meeting with my tutees and some lovely colleagues cheered me up. So obviously that's illustrating nice support from colleagues. I need to feel supported, and someone to tell me I'm not worthless. Talking to my husband helped. So obviously they're getting support from colleagues and getting support from family members. But interpersonal relationships were also a source of tension. And here we have two quotes, and mainly referring to the source of tension about being from leadership within the university. So there is an expectation from managers for us to attend all online meetings. I could skip some of them and use my time on a more productive task. So this is the frustrating aspect of, because we are online, we're expected to be, or the participants are expected to be available all the time, when in fact they could be doing something which they might consider more productive. Those in leadership are so out of touch with what is happening on the shop floor. Systems, such as for online teaching, made no sense. We need to work more hours because it ticks a box. So what this participant was referring to was strategies that management are asking lecturers to do, were purely just things that, as the quote says, just ticking a box, rather than being productive towards the learning environment for the students. But there was also some positive aspects between the tutor-student alliance. In a couple of times, our participant mentioned students being actually very supportive to them. And this is a nice quote. A student typed in the chat, "You were doing great." That's lovely, isn't it? "I truly hate teaching online, but somehow we have still become connected as a little community." Which is very nice, and shows that how important the communication and between tutor and student is, and how it isn't always negative. There are some positive examples. Okay, so the next theme is about professional identity, and sadly this is illustrated nicely by "My Spirit is Broken," and how difficult our participants have found the current situation, and how it's affecting their personal identity, their right to autonomy, satisfaction, and being acknowledged. So the first, the sense of achievement or satisfaction, but in fact this is lack of satisfaction, as illustrated nicely in the quotes. So feeling of tiredness and low satisfaction caused by long procedures or tasks that I need to do in order to tick another box. And I feel like all the creativity that comes from face-to-face teaching has been taken away, and I barely feel a sense of purpose teaching online. So we've already acknowledged this, that face-to-face teaching and online teaching involve very, very different skill sets and a different type of creativity that our participants weren't always ready for. Feeling acknowledged and valued, or not feeling acknowledged or valued. I feel trapped at a place where no one recognizes my efforts. I often think how it could have been if the powers that be had taken just a minute of their time to consult with staff and students. Yeah, so this is illustrating how the university organizations are kind of not taking into consideration the opinions of staff who could offer very positive and constructive ways of teaching online, and that this was kind of ignored a little. Need to wrap up. Okay, agency and autonomy. I managed to do quite a lot today, but not for my own research. This frustrates me. Spent lots of time on tasks that wasn't worth it. So again, this is not respecting staff's ability to actually think for themselves and make appropriate choices about their work. Okay, drowning, this is about the well-being environment, difficulty with self-care and coping strategies, which sometimes were positive, sometimes negative, the responsibilities of others' well-being, and especially students, and how this is an extra burden and a negative effect often on staff's well-being, and the institution-wide culture of well-being, or lack of it. And I just will actually read those quotes about the institution-wide culture. Well-being is so far down the list of my institution's priorities. Everyone demands something from me. There is no support, no leadership. And I think I better move on to the next if we only have a minute. Okay, so the conclusion from our study is there's definitely a reliance on staff to carry on regardless, but that this is not sustainable, okay? That the well-being of staff is being seriously affected and we risk burnout. So the current situation, there are stresses that may have been there before but are now worsened by the current situation. The lack of strategic direction, certainly that doesn't take into consideration the professionals, the lecturers actually trying to carry out the changes that are required. And this is being done, there might be some training, but if there is, it's not appropriate. And if you want staff to actually buy into institutional changes and different ways of teaching, they need to be consulted. Okay, which is actually what we're saying here about involving all stakeholders. Now, and then this brings us to the fact that we hope to continue with our research. We want to expand our qualitative research. So if anybody's interested in taking part in our study, we'd be really appreciate that. And this is really important that there is definitely a model in universities, I don't know about schools, where we kind of focus on of individual resilience. But we need to look at the models of collective resilience, about how we need to work together and actually listen to each other and take into consideration what staff need. And that's it. Okay, so sorry, that was really quick.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you to all our speakers. I know everyone had so much to say, and if only we had more time, but all the presentations will be available online. So if you wanted to review anything, of course, please do, and get in touch with any of the speakers. We're going to move straight onto the panel now, because I'm conscious that we're sort of running a little bit over schedule. So I would like to welcome someone else to our panel. We've got the speakers. Unfortunately, Shavita had to leave us, but the other speakers are staying for the panel. So if there are any questions that have come up you didn't have a chance to ask before, please do take the opportunity now. So I really like to welcome Shelby Momba-Cat to the panel. And Shelby is a humanities teacher from South Lincolnshire. So I'm going to pass you over to Lydia and Jonathan, who are going to be fielding questions and leading on this section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you very much, Siobhan, as well, for an exciting piece of research. I'm sure that we will be able to expand on some of the ideas that your research raised. I think it's fair to start with a couple of questions that we have here. So the first question is from Susan, and she's asking, do you think the impact of technology on stress might depend on the jobs different people have? Susan admits that it has contributed to hers when she's teaching students with ropey Wi-Fi connections or hardware. I'm not sure if this is aimed for a specific member of the panel, but feel free to respond as you see fit.
Lydia, I can respond to that. I've had experience of I'm sure we've all had experience of dealing with ropey technology. It's very stressful, isn't it? So when you share your slides and the stress of knowing whether it's going to work and whether you can play videos, etc. And I was once in the middle of a presentation, and all of my audience of 100 and something students had been knocked out. So as soon as I went to share, everybody disappeared, and I was speaking to myself for 40 minutes. I couldn't see that the audience were not there because I was actually looking at some slides, and that's stressful, isn't it? So I think I've definitely experienced stress. So yeah, I can relate to that, and also I think it's different teaching online because the students don't want to necessarily share their cameras. Well, they don't want to share their cameras, and therefore you feel that you're speaking to yourself because you don't get any feedback. Teaching is better when it's more dialogic and you can have a discussion with students and you get feedback, and then that will spur more discussion. You feel like you're on a monologue and you just kind of imparting information. It doesn't feel like teaching really, and that can be not good for well-being either. So those are my experiences.
I will definitely second that feeling. Actually, I hate it even during presentations, but also while teaching online. The fact that even the slightest attempt at having a joke is met with complete silence because everyone's muted. So you feel like, okay, maybe I shouldn't even have made that joke. I'm supposed to be completely serious here. It's a different kind of mode. So yeah, I can definitely personally relate to that. If we don't have anybody else who would like to contribute to that.
I can just add in, sorry. I'm obviously a secondary school teacher, so a little bit different, 11 to 16. And to kind of further what Jonathan was saying, I think there's also a certain level of that social aspect that's missing that's really hard to get on online learning. And when you mentioned about turning your cameras on, my school actually has created a policy where we keep our cameras off for safety and protection. And we've noticed, or I've noticed personally, that a large number of some of our SEN students really can't engage when it's just auditory. They need to see your face. That whole element of teaching has really been highlighted and has really limited some students from being able to even access these adjustments that we have been making. So it's very interesting.
Can I add something to that? I mean, this point about interactivity is extremely interesting, and it was raised up throughout all the, I think most or if not all of the talks here. As a researcher who has been researching interactivity in online learning for many years now, it's really a really interesting point, because most of us who have been teaching face-to-face is kind of, we are accustomed to interact using verbal, non-verbal cues. So we watch the body languages, we look into our students' eyes. We're kind of expecting that kind of interactivity, where online learning, and when we say online learning, we must appreciate that it's not just online in terms of live sessions. It's not just Zoom sessions. It's way more than that, and it's about reconceptualizing what interactivity is. Interactivity can be many other sensory cues other than just looking and using cameras. And I think that is, I mean, for me and for any of you, I guess, that was teaching face to face, we are kind of trying to replicate the same feeling when we are teaching online. So we are kind of and teaching with a screen of many black screens is really like you feel stress, you feel anxious, you feel that you cannot really follow what's going on with your students, etc. It's really about breaking that conceptualization that this is the only way of feeling interactive or having interactive with our students. I think that would be
do you have some suggestions on how that's possible, Carmel? Because, you know, everything I relate to everything you say, and I'm always trying to get my students to unmute and speak to me because they can, but they have got into kind of this cultural using chat, and they will always prefer to type than to speak to me now, which I find really strange, because we could actually talk to one another.
Many students, yeah, this is an amazing point. I think many students and many of us as well would appreciate not synchronous communication. So for example, students that have any kind of struggle with language, sensories, executive skills, or even just shy, you know, they would benefit from deliberating, thinking about what they want to say, and doing it not on the spot. So it's so intrusive to see all your classmates just here in front of you, and being expected to respond on the spot. So I think one of the ways, there's a lot of research about online communities that are designed around interactivity for learning, and I emphasize on the design, because the design is crucial. You can't just put a chat box or a forum and expect them to be interactive. So that's one point. Another point would be data collection about how they are engaged and how they interact. There is a wealth of opportunities to collect very meaningful data that would give you as a teacher much more information about how your students interact, feel, engage, participant, present in everything that you are talking to, rather than just watching their body language. And I say that with total appreciation that there is no replacement. I mean, it's not a replacement. It's not instead of looking at our students and talking to them and having them speak with us, but there are a lot of advantages and things that we can do with technology that we cannot do in the class. So I think we just need to appreciate that it's not the same, as many of you have said. It's not the same. It's not the same medium. It's something completely different. We need to think about interactivity in a different way and set some new design in place.
Absolutely. We have to think beyond ways of transposing the face-to-face towards online, and we really need to start thinking in different terms. How can we leverage the affordances that are available to us within an online environment and were not previously available? This gives me a very nice segue into one of the questions that I had for Terry, but I'm going to wait a little bit because we've got some questions coming through, and I'll have to give priority to these. So Megan says, this is really interesting and also true of support services, having to adjust to provide support at a time of hugely increased demand, also needing to ensure crisis support can be provided safely. I'm assuming crisis support for practitioners as much as for students, right? So is there anybody who would like to comment on that?
I think I can come in there in the sense that I think in terms of as a statement, I think clearly agree in the sense that I think trying to cope for the whole spectrum of kind of issues that have come up is really necessary. And we're seeing kind of that historically, I guess people have fell through the gaps, and I think we're seeing that increasingly in the sense that lots of people are, locked down in their own rooms, and that reaching out for support can be difficult for people. I suppose I'm aware that organisations like COOTH and the NSPCC provide kind of support for young people, kind of who maybe kind of need that additional support in the sort of circumstance of crisis. Whether or not, I think there's a more systemic issue about the kind of resource and kind of funding that keeps these organisations going that hasn't been fully addressed, in the sense that I think that these organisations are probably taking a larger load than they ordinarily would do, but are not necessarily receiving additional funding for doing so. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it was a response to it.
Yes. Do you see any ways of, in terms of the future of services such as COOTH, do you see any ways of actually integrating these within educational settings? To come back to what Carmel was saying about giving insights to educators about where the students are at and feeding this data into the decisions that they make in the classroom.
I think this is, sorry, I think this is sort of one of the big challenges, is we're starting to enter into this idea that, I talk about the positive virtual ecosystem, but there will be a kind of, in some ways there's got to be a point when we see it as a health ecosystem, or a mental health and wellbeing ecosystem more broadly, in the sense that I guess face-to-face services and online services have to interact in some ways. COOTH is commissioned locally. I don't want to speak too much for them in the sense I don't know fully their structure, but they do feed with their local commissioning. It means that they do feed back to kind of local clinical commissioning groups. Whether or not that information also feeds back into schools, etc., I'm less sure about. But I think that is something for the future that we need to really understand, is the interplay between the virtual or digital and face-to-face kind of provisions that are being offered.
Absolutely. There is a question for Michelle and Siobhan. Will you carry on collecting data?
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, and if anybody would like to offer to participate, then you can contact myself or Michelle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I said, the sort of initial impetus for this study was from, hearing from colleagues and really being aware of that very different environment and how that was having such an impact on well-being. And so this was just the first stage in an exploratory study, and Siobhan and I are definitely going to expand this out. So we'll be contacting you about this in the future, in the near future. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Jonathan, do you have?
I just wonder whether Shelby could speak about your experiences in school over the pandemic, during the pandemic, and maybe how you've addressed some of the challenges.
Yeah, most definitely. A lot of actually what Siobhan and Michelle said, I think, are very similar themes, especially in my secondary school. I'm in a rural school, very diverse socioeconomically, and quite a large SEND population. So when I view e-education and mental well-being, I kind of have to see it through that lens because that's my only experience. But I think with the use of technology through now all 3 lockdowns, in the midst of the 3rd lockdown, I think what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling is that certain level of burnout, kind of with everybody. We have a level of burnout with the teachers, obviously increased workload. We have a burnout with the parents. They're put in an extraordinary situation where they have to be managing kind of every aspect all at once. And then we do have a burnout with the students. Now, I can acknowledge, Carmel kind of mentioned that there are a lot of positives with this online learning. It has really benefited certain students' learning styles and has offered them opportunities that we would have never seen in our school. Outside of ICT or maybe a business lesson, we don't have very much tech available on the day-to-day or lesson-to-lesson opportunities. Especially when we were in school in the fall, in our COVID restrictions, we had students who were doing ICT lessons and they weren't able to be in a computer lab. So technology has offered them a lot of opportunities, and some of them have responded really well. We've also noticed, or I've noticed another positive from it, is there's a reduction of distractions and also the behavior of it, where learning's being able to take place more effectively, but only really with those that are engaging. And that's the biggest issue, is that we don't have everybody engaging. So we have that knowledge gap that keeps expanding with every week of lessons and every session that we do, that I only get 50% or 60% turnout. I automatically have that gap in my learning. And I think the biggest thing that teachers and schools in general are going to have to consider is, when we do go back to whatever normal may look like, how are we going to address that learning gap? Because when it's mentioned that students have missed out on so much, I think it's very easy for us to put that down to curriculum and content that they've obviously clearly missed out on. But they're also missing out on all of that social, all of those interactions, all of that hidden curriculum that exists that's so important. Time management, collaboration, resilience, which somebody else has mentioned, all of that has also missed. So I think a lot of when I think of mental health and well-being, and personally as a teacher, a lot of my anxiety and frustration is kind of doing that return to school, and how do we pick up the pieces and how do we try to put the pieces back together, because all of that is still so unknown. So I don't know if I answered any of the questions, but
brilliant, Shelby. I wonder, could you comment on the staff and how they've responded and the challenges they've faced?
Yeah, through all three, like obviously all three lockdowns, I think, which Michelle and Siobhan mentioned, is there's been an increased workload, obviously. But not only that, we've also blurred all boundaries that we may have put in place. Our work-life balance is completely non-existent. I'm sitting in my living room where I also do my work every day. So it's hard to kind of disassociate that idea of what is work and what is home. And as this third lockdown has started, we have tried to really provide a very structured timetable that reflects the normal school day, which puts a lot of pressure on teachers, because you obviously can't just, a streamed lesson is not the same as a face-to-face lesson. There's massive changes that have to happen. And when you're having to do that 20, 21 times a week, trying to make those adjustments, it's a lot. And then you also have the emotional strain of yourself having to make it through this pandemic, but also worrying about all of those other students and children who are in your care and making sure they're making it through it. You know, the unknown, and kind of what Carmel said is the black screen and the chat box, it's very limiting. And I think it would be very interesting to see if there's a way that we can make it more interactive when it comes to kind of the well-being side of it, because I can see in a chat when I ask how they're doing and they say, I'm good. They could say that, but I probably know that that's not the truth. And I'm not with them. I don't see their mannerisms. I don't see all of those other things that I would clue into as a teacher. So that worry for your students is a natural thing, but it's heightened, which adds to the workload and the stress load of teachers. And like it was mentioned in the interactive, communication, I think is difficult in the best of times. And I think has been really difficult through this lockdown, communicating internally with governing bodies and exam boards and all of that stuff. Communication has also really had a big impact on kind of how we view our job, and also how we interact with our job. And the media doesn't help necessarily. But yeah, I think overall it's easier now. I think as time gotten on, we've gotten more opportunities to train, and the CPD has been there to kind of pick up the pieces, but there was a big movement there where I think it was a steady decline in staff well-being.
Thank you. And that chimes with some of the research that my colleague, Dr. Josie Maitland, did. So she carried out interviews with a number of teachers and senior leaders, and some of them found the experience as positive, some of them found the experience as negative during lockdown. But one of the key issues that emerged from that research is that teachers felt that their professional autonomy had been taken away because decisions had just been imposed on them. They were not involved in any of the decisions. They were just, and school leaders were just excluded from any policy decisions at the time, and that obviously reduced their professional autonomy. So I think it's positives and negatives, but we have to remember that young people and staff have gone through these multiple transitions, haven't they? And some of those transitions are positive, some of them are negative. If they've got good resilience and good self-esteem, that will support them through those transitions. But it's interesting to hear those experiences, Shelby, from a real school and a real context.
I think it's also difficult for students because I don't know if they fully understand maybe how much of an impact this has actually had on them, especially when I think like my year 7s. I don't know if they really understand, how much this is going to change their relationship with school, how different it's going to be when they come back, obviously from distance learning. So having to navigate all of that and having to pick up the pieces in mental health and well-being, it's going to be interesting what expectations teachers have, where their priority is going to lie, because that curriculum and the hidden curriculum, they both have to coexist. And it'll be interesting to see where we need to place our focus on more to obviously get the best results. But yeah, thank you.
Or how can we encapsulate one within the other, not necessarily sort of separate them? I have a question. Thank you very much, Shelby. I have a question from Dani, who says, what references are there for the different forms of interactive online engagement following Carmel's comments?
So there is almost 20 years of research on that. The two things that I already mentioned, I think, are the anchors of all of it. And to go back to what we heard now from Shelby, which is extremely interesting and useful, I think we cannot think about well-being as one component as of other components that we are in some kind of danger with. Because the well-being is actually not just a component next to the curriculum or the learning gap, etc. It's what would enable all the rest. So to me, I'm really surprised. I'm looking at my daughters every morning, getting up, turning up these live sessions, and learning as if nothing happened. It seems to me like schools are trying to, inevitably, because that's what they have to do, not necessarily what they would choose to do, but that they are trying to put up a message of everything is as it was. It's nothing changed. You have seen me a few weeks ago in class. Now you see me here. You done your exercises in class. Now you do it here. Nothing has changed, but really their world is upside down. So, to me, I think we cannot keep on doing everything as if everything is normal. We need to acknowledge that something really, really significant have changed, and to prioritize again and again and again our well-being. And for that, and I'm coming back to the interactivity question, Lydia, well-being especially for children and for young adults is about interacting and doing that kind of social reflection and building themselves and their identities on top of their social interaction. So there are so many. So again, I'm going back to the two components that I already mentioned. One of them is better data collection. So look, for example, at the amazing research that Siobhan and Michelle just showed us. They have shown us a very fine-grained day-to-day reflections in diaries. Now, let's imagine that Shelby would be able to get those diaries in a very effective way while not having to do actually all of the hard work of the qualitative analysis that Siobhan and Michelle was doing, but something much more effective or much more quick to be able to see where all her students are. So to have eyes and ears where she doesn't have right now, because right now she kind of lost her eyes and ears. So think about much better streamlined day-to-day fine-grained data collection on where they are, how they reflect on how they feel, how they reflect on their learning, how they reflect on what they are finding, that is challenging or better. Or so if Shelby would have this kind of way to hear, and I'm not talking even about interacting, even the basic component of interacting, just actually listen and get the right data, other than just asking them in the chat box, how are you, and then get, I'm good. That would give her so much better ways to go ahead and interact and adapt everything. So one thing, again, better data collection. And we know that, one of the things that is good about online learning and using technologies is the opportunity to collect better data and, find great data. So that's one thing. The other thing that I already mentioned is online communities, not just between the class, but also between teachers. And, there are all kinds of very, very different learning designs of how to debate, how to develop arguments, how to develop research skills, everything just by having discourse. So very interactive discourse. So these are just two things to think about.
Thank you, Carmel. I'm just becoming conscious of time. Do we have time for one more question? Can we take this one more question? All right, Michelle?
I think we've got time. Yeah, we've got time.
All right, thank you. Oops, hang on, let me find it again. It's a question from Golsa. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. So when we consider the online counseling, do you think psychologists to see face-to-face and even feel the symptoms to understand better what counselees are ailing from? I believe, again, this is a question from Terry, but again, anybody else that feels that they can contribute, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I'll start. I think without doubt working online is different to working face-to-face. And so the sense of being able to pick things up in the presence of someone and sort of get a sense of, what might be distressing them will be different. I think the bit that I would hold on to is that sometimes face-to-face can mean that people don't share things with you, whereas online means that some people will be more honest, and there's this talk of the disinhibition effect. So people may actually share more online than they would face-to-face as well. So I think one of the other speakers mentioned the idea there's no one size fits all. I think that an online provision has to be part of the package, but it won't be for everyone, without doubt. That's where I'll stop.
Diversity and personalization in the types of provision that are available, or even blended systems in the ways counseling is provided. Thank you very much, Terry. Is there anybody else who would like to contribute? Yes, Michelle.
Sort of just prompted something, because when you talked about the disinhibition effect, because I've noticed that students are prepared to disclose a lot on email that they will send. And some students with this academic year that I hadn't actually met face-to-face, and they would disclose a huge amount. But then I don't know how to respond. I think it's very, very difficult then to know how to, have the right response. If I was having a personal tutor session with someone, that's a completely different interaction. And I know I felt, because one of the things that has come up about the transition to doing online teaching is having the training, but I think equally so for being able to respond to the the pastoral side of things. And I've you know, on more than one occasion, I know it's not just me, have been completely stumped with how to deal with some of the things that are disclosed in an email. So, I don't know, any tips for anyone?
I could respond again in the
Yes,
sense
please.
that I was involved in developing an online counselling service sort of at the turn of the sort of about 1999 or something, and it was interesting. We went into it very clumsily, and before we knew it, we were getting these emails that were bigger than we anticipated. And I think from then, I think that there have been lots of developments in the work of online therapy, where people talk about how you may contract that space, you know, and often it's about sort of getting in there quite soon. Like, therapy is different to teaching, and I can see echoes of what you've just shared with my own students. And having to be clear from the outset, you know, what people can email me about, or what I may be able to respond to, and what my turnaround might be, has become more important in sort of defining, well, my role, as opposed to maybe the university counselling service or the support service. But it's always harder. I find it harder to respond when it happens the other way around. So someone kind of comes in with a question like you've said, when actually those perimeters maybe aren't that defined for that person. So my advice would probably be try and get in there earlier, but then that's not very helpful for the situation you're in now.
Well, thank you anyway. That was food for thought. And thank you to all our speakers. Reluctantly, we're going to have to draw things to a close. So I hope you've enjoyed today's conference. I hope you've learnt something from it. I know I certainly have. And I think for me, one of the big challenges moving forward is trying to, you know, keep to my boundaries. And just because the technology is there and we can work 24/7, we shouldn't be doing it. And of course, self-care is, you know, it should be a priority. But as Siobhan and I was saying, it's much more about collective resilience as well. And it's down to decision makers and, you know, senior managers who make the decisions. They need to prioritize mental health and wellbeing for staff and students and do practical steps that can make a tangible difference. So Lydia, any closing thoughts from you before we have to say goodbye?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of make this point that people think of educational technology as this force of automation, efficiency, and perhaps personalization, yes, but we haven't quite figured out what exactly that means. And I think that educational technology can also be a force of collaboration and human connection. And this is a theme that has emerged very, very strongly from today's discussion and presentations. And I think it sort of leads to questions of around, you know, what is our vision around the next generation of educational technology and its pedagogical deployment that will sort of allow us to move the needle towards more collaborative forms of learning, teaching, working together, and just sharing, really, and understanding our emotions, our peers' emotions, and our students' emotions, and taking action to sort of improve those towards more positive ways of being and acting. So thank you very much, everybody. Just wanted to, say very, very quickly, can I say it now, Michelle, or was there anything else that you wanted to say before that?
That's fine. No, you go ahead, Lydia.
I just wanted to say a very, very big thank you, obviously, to all our speakers and to BRA Events for organizing the event today. And thank you to Carmel, Terry, Shavita, Siobhan and Michelle for wearing multiple hats today. And thank you to Anthea as well for her help and support. And just very, very quickly to say that our new Twitter account is now up and running of the Educational Technology Special Interest Group of BRA. So please do feel free to follow us on Twitter and to stay informed about future events and other opportunities. Thank you.